Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. I love spending this time of day with you, and welcome to my video home. And if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you'll already know that you can communicate with me directly by typing your comments or questions directly into whatever platform you may be watching on, and they'll appear here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And that's one of my favorite parts of this broadcast. This week, we have been talking about spirits, the spirit world, mediumship, etc. And today is going to continue in that line. Today we're going to talk about the rites of the dead. And hello to Deb in the chat room. It's good to see you, Deb. And before we do that, however, I want to take a moment to announce that my new book, The Corellian Book of the Dead, is now available for pre-order at CorellianPublishing.com. And obviously, the fact that I've been working on this book is why, in part, I'm talking about these subjects at this time. They're simply at the top of my head. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you. And, you know, it's also part of the time of year we're in, part of the time of life I'm in, and simply an interesting subject. And, you know, my whole life has been spent working with the spirits, working with the spirits of the dead in particular, the ancestors, the spirit guides, to the point that I'm hard-pressed to think of life before this. I mean, it certainly didn't go back to the very beginning in the most literal sense, because I learned this in my teen years and perfected it over the course of many years. But at the same time, the spirits were always there. They were there when I was a child. I didn't always necessarily understand in the way that I understand now what I was experiencing, but they were there and they were speaking to me even then. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And I think that particularly for those who are conscious incarnates or anything similar, where you're bringing through a lot of abilities dealing with this sort of thing, it likely will be there from very early on. So in a manner of speaking, I don't know that I do remember life without this being an aspect. I certainly don't remember life without spirituality being an aspect, because many of the earliest things I remember were spiritual teachings. I lost my grandmother very early in life, which led to a lot of talk of spirituality in my house, even more than usual. And so I was exposed to these ideas right at the very beginning, and exposed to the influence of the spirit guides right at the very beginning, even before I understood how to do it. But, and this is a very important but, it's all well and good to have a certain natural capability. A lot of people think that's the best. I totally do not agree. But it's good if you then go ahead and get training. The training is still important, because no matter how much you're pulling through, there are things you may not. The training will teach you how to handle the energy in ways that just naturally working with it might not equip you for. So no matter how naturally you may have psychic ability, and there are some who simply do, it's still good to get a systematic form of training. It will be helpful to you. So when we talk about mediumship, when we talk about working with the guides, like I say, I've always had that aspect in my life, but I was a teenager when I started to actually learn it. And I've had a great many experiences, which I believe in retrospect, and I even believed at the time, actually, that they were sent by the guides, by the ancestors. In my case, these two are usually the same thing, not always, but usually. to lead me to the skills I needed. For example, working in the psychic fairs. And I've talked before about how the best training to be a psychic is working in psychic fairs in inconvenient places, working with tight time limits that when you first start, you might not think you can do, working in very noisy environments, which when you first start, you might not think you'll be able to concentrate, but you can. And by learning this, you'll be able to read in any circumstance. I can remember the first time I tried reading in the middle of a crowded um, mall and thinking, how do people do this? But I did do it. And it didn't take very long for it to be quite easy. It was just a matter of being able to focus your concentration. And when you have that ability, you can use it anywhere. I can remember when I first started reading, I needed at least 20 minutes to do a full reading. But over time, this got dropped down, even right away, very quickly, because at that same psychic fair, they wanted you to do lectures, which one of the most common forms was to do, quote, mini readings, which would take only a couple of minutes. And I found for me, this was very helpful. For one thing, when you're doing what you might call a mini reading, you're getting in much faster and you're getting the information out much faster. And learning that you can do that is very valuable. Years later in Salem, we offered 5-minute readings as a sample to draw people in to get full readings. And it had some success. Also at some level did not, because very often that 5-minute reading was all they actually needed, at least if I was doing it. I was not the only reader there doing it, but I could find pretty much everything they wanted to ask within 5 minutes. Why? Because I had a long history of doing short readings where I get straight in, get the answers right away, and it was very helpful. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. It's good to see you, Ravenwolf. I found these things to greatly improve my style as a reader. I remember once, and hello to Calvin from Temple of the Oak in Raleigh, North Carolina. Good to see you, Calvin. It's good to see you. I remember once we had picketers at one of the psychic fairs claiming that you could not get a good reading at a psychic fair and should go to an at-home psychic on the premise that they had everything they needed and all the time they needed and could do better. And hello to Ebony in the psychic fair. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello to Ebony in the chat room. Although, you know, there might be some sort of omen in having misstated that. Hello to Davika in the chat room. And Davika is greeting us from India. It's good to see you, Davika. But Reverend Marlena, who was part of the management of the J&M fairs, asked them to come in and talk to them and explain to them why she felt they were totally wrong and she was right. Because, you know, anyone can have everything they need. They can have their meditational music and their candles and all the time they want to take, and in most cases do a good reading. But to be able to do a good reading in a short period of time in a place like a hotel convention center or a mall took real skill, far more skill than someone who had never done such a thing. She was totally right about that. So if you're thinking of becoming a psychic, if you're thinking of learning these things, I highly recommend doing them in inconvenient places, doing them with time limits that may challenge you, because that's how you learn to do it best. And in particular, consider working with a psychic fair for the skill it will teach you, not necessarily for any other reason. There is no better training, in my opinion. Now, granted, you need to have basic training first, but once you've got that, to learn how to really do it, psychic fairs are wonderful. Now, today we were going to talk about the rites of the dead. And the thing that actually started me wanting to talk to that subject was the idea of funerals. You know, I was talking with Lady Alyssa last night, and we were talking about how both of us were history nerds from childhood, and it is fascinating to me to study funeral customs around the world, and they vary considerably, and how people look at them varies considerably. What we know about the earliest funerals, um, and how often people try to claim they were not funerals, but just happen to look like it. But we know that we've been practicing ceremonial internment of our dead for a very long time as humans, and certainly well into our prehistory. And certain things do tend or appear to have been relatively universal, including providing the deceased with things that were obviously meant for their comfort or prosperity. Although in the case of things like flowers, which occur in some of the earliest funerals, they may have been for the comfort of the living by covering up the smell of the decaying body. But they might also have been partly for the pleasure of the dead as well. We know that from very, very early on, humans would include grave goods in our burials of the dead. And I'm hard pressed to think of anywhere in the world that you don't see this early on in history. And what do we mean by grave goods? We mean usually everyday items buried along with the deceased that they might need in the afterlife. Sometimes it was things like cooking pots, jewelry, because from fairly early on we seem to have buried people in nice things. Sometimes it was things that were connected to their profession, particularly spiritually speaking. If they had been a priestess, a shamaness, or what have you, that's often determined archaeologically by the things they were buried with. I remember a story from the Lawrence Museum. They had a piece of archaeology from what was at that time considered the oldest burial of a shaman in the United States. They had acquired it from the Indianapolis Museum, I believe. And the way that it had been determined that this figure had been a shaman was that she was buried with a bag full of herbs. And there seemed to be no better solution for why that would be. They were not necessarily cooking herbs. So that's an example of early grave goods. As time went on, grave goods became far more extravagant according to the wealth of the individuals. We all know about the ancient Egyptians and how extravagant they were with grave goods. The very wealthy would have tombs full of everyday items, and also very often miniature models of everyday items. And this is very important because it speaks to what the offerings were actually thought of as being. And for me, as a person who practices ancestor veneration in the modern world, this is a very important point. And also just pagan religion in general. When we make an offering, it isn't because the spirit needs the offering. It's an exchange of energy. It's a gesture. And what we offer, they are not taking in a physical form, but in an astral form. And as we know, we can do a lot of things in the astral. But if you look back at the ancient Egyptian tombs, which included things sometimes like miniature houses or miniature scenes from daily life, obviously, they did not think that the ancestor in the tomb was going to take forward the miniature version of this thing. They thought it would assume a full version in the astral afterlife. By the way, the term astral does come from the Egyptians, and is related to the word tuah, which was symbolized by the pentagram, which is an interesting little fact for people. And when representing the land of spirit, it would be put in a circle, much as we often do with pentagrams today. And by the way, the word pentacle and the word pentagram are not related and do not refer to the same thing, which is a totally different subject, and now I'm rambling. But when we talk about making offerings to the ancestors, it isn't that they need that favorite meal on the anniversary of their death, or a cup of coffee to remind them of what coffee is. They need it to remind them that we are still here, we still remember them, we still care about them, and they should still care about us, which is part of the concept of ancestor veneration. There are certain spiritual points of view which hold that the spirit just goes on after it dies. Obviously, that is a very different point of view than one which venerates the ancestors. Venerating the ancestors is about their still being involved in our lives, even though they have gone on and undoubtedly have their own things going on in the afterlife, but they're still watching over us here. Even if parts of their soul have already reincarnated. So getting back to the rites of the dead, I wanted to start this with funerals. And I mentioned, I got into offerings from funerals, but if you look at the vast numbers of grave goods that you see in the Egyptian funerals, in Sumerian funerals, and others, you'll see they took this very seriously. Very early on in human history, certain people would choose to accompany other people in death, and they would either be killed or commit suicide to go with them, particularly wives, but not always. And in some parts of the world, this lasted for a long time. In many parts of the world, it did not. In Egypt, this appears to have been the custom in the first dynasty, but never after. What changed that, we don't know. But those early people obviously were not afraid of dying. They did not regard it as an end, or they would not have been doing that. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about, a lot of people will say that funerals are actually for the living, not for the dead. And this can be true. It depends on who we're talking about. But if we look at these cultures, and if we look at people from certain backgrounds, I believe it is very important to them, to their spirit, that the proper amenities are observed. If we look at the ancient Greeks, they had far simpler funeral customs, but they believed they must be observed. The story of Antigone is all about this, and how she could not leave her brother unburied, even though all that she felt able to do was throw a little dirt over him, because her uncle, the king, had decreed that he must not be buried as such, but she could not do nothing because she believed it was important to his spirit. And I think that particularly for some, the spirit is still there through the mourning ceremonies. We know from so many experiences and stories and so forth that it's not uncommon for a spirit to be around people they loved long after they have died. So they may very well care about these things. So my point of view is that you don't just ignore them on the premise that the spirit couldn't care about them, because it's quite possible they might. If there are particular last wishes, you should observe them. And in fact, many of the great historical ghost stories have been about last wishes not being observed. So I think these are of importance when we look at the subject of funerals. In the Corellian tradition, we have a particular formal sort of funeral which so far has only been used for members of the Council of Elders, mostly. A couple of others actually, now that I think about it. But mostly only at the highest level because it is very formal. But part of what it includes is, what is the name? It includes a blessing using water for cleansing, the hydrophoria. And it is certainly when my time comes, I'm assuming that that is what will happen. At my funeral, when Lady Windy passed, that was the funeral she received. I haven't really explained it more than generally, but it includes, in particular, talking about the person who has passed on, the influences they had in your life, and how now they return to spirit, just as a river flows to the sea. And I think that whatever our customs are, I think that people do tend to notice, in some cases, whether they don't happen when they die. Now, some spirits do just move on. They don't wait to see these things. And that's particularly true if in life they thought that's what was going to happen. I mentioned yesterday Lady Bitterwind's father, Harry Daw, who just went on to have apparently quite a happy afterlife, but no interaction with her except for a single dream when they had a very positive exchange, but it didn't start anymore because that's simply not what he perceived any part of his afterlife including. And this will be different for different people. Now, in addition to funeral rites, when we're talking about ancestor veneration, there are also things like anniversary feasts that you might choose to have. Particularly the very first anniversary, there are, if you're wanting to have a close relationship with the ancestor, there are even daily offerings you might make. And I was taught and teach that when someone has crossed over, you want to wait about a year before you try to establish a relationship with them as an ancestor. And the reason for this is so that they have time to become accustomed to being dead, for want of a better way to put it, although they don't really like to be called dead. Because they're really not. They're very much alive where they are. But what I've learned over the years is that it really doesn't have to do with them at all. It has to do with you. You know, when I was young, people would talk about the ancestors occasionally trying to pull the living over after them. What I've found is that although that does happen, it's the other way around. It's the living who cannot let go. You take your year of mourning to let go. And then you can have a relationship with them. But if you try it too soon, in many cases, it will be a problem for you, not necessarily for them. Although they also need time to heal, they need time to adjust. And this is another reason for that. So generally speaking, I say wait a year, with the exception of if they come to you. Now, when Lady Windy died, she was talking to people within 24 hours. There was no need for waiting a year to talk to her. And I've known this with some other people as well. But, you know, with my mother, it took 2 years before I could really speak to her as a guide. When the first year was over, I was told, no, wait. And this, I was later led to believe, had to do with my father and things that she was preoccupied doing for him as he came to the end of his own life. And we have to remember they do have more than one thing going on. And Calvin says, regarding funerals and the time after, it's a time to celebrate their lives as well as their passing, viewing it as the beginning of the next phase of their and our existence, which is certainly true. And Ravenwolf remarks that that they have become stronger as a medium and a woman since their parents died. And Lady Windy frequently talks to them as well. Lady Windy has talked to a lot of people. Most of our Corellian ancestors speak to a number of people. And one of the things that's been very interesting to me over the years is seeing, because, you know, especially at first, in the early years of the Great Expansion, there were historical aspects of the ancestors that were talked about in public and people knew. But their personalities, if you had not known them, or did not know me to hear it in the story somewhere, you wouldn't have had any way to know. And yet, people come to me and tell me about the experiences they were having with the ancestors and accurately describe their personalities. And, you know, to me, that's one of the confirmations that we get that these are genuine happenings. And we were talking the other day about how people sometimes wonder if something is their imagination or a real spiritual happening. And my answer was, in part, you know, it will prove itself to you. This is an example of that. People would describe, for example, things they were experiencing with my late mother as a spirit guide, who had never known my mother, knew nothing about her personally, but were able to accurately describe how she would behave. Lady Gloria, I remember people doing the same thing. Lady Gloria had a very particular personality. You wouldn't accidentally happen on it if you hadn't actually seen it, but people were seeing it and describing it. To me, that was definite proof that they too were having real experiences. And when we talk about working with the ancestors, they are still part of our lives if we have this relationship with them, and sometimes if we don't. And when we talk about the rites of the dead, taking that time to build that relationship is probably the most important rite of the dead of all. And how do we do that? We do it by setting up a regular time to talk to them. I would say once a day, but it could be once a week. Could be even less if your life requires it to be. But you want to make an offering to them of some sort, maybe light a candle, maybe something more extravagant, and just tell them where you're at, how you're feeling, that you want to build a relationship with them. And then you sit and you wait for their answers. And we've talked about how to do this in other programs. We're near the end of our half hour, so perhaps I'll talk about it a little more tomorrow. But basically, you just let it come through. And that really is the simplest explanation for how you develop a working relationship with the ancestors. Now, Calvin says, perhaps it is because we view the cycle of birth, life, and death and rebirth as something magical and spiritual, a never-ending, ever-turning wheel. Rather than being disconnected from death and dying, we acknowledge it as part of a sacred evolution. Well, that is a very important thing. Another thing that we must talk about on the subject that we're discussing, again, not today, we're out of time, but the different ways in which a pagan sometimes views dying from a Christian. I have found, for example, working with my mother at the end of her life, coming several times to what might have been the end of mine, and other situations, that we do tend, in many cases, to look at it quite differently than they do. And I think that's something we also must discuss. And Renee says, excellent discussion. Thank you, Renee. So perhaps tomorrow we'll discuss these things. But thank you for joining me today. I love having these talks with you. It is the bright point of my day. And thank you all. I love all of you. And let us close with our prayer as we normally do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for leading us through the dance of life and death, for being always with us. Help us always to remember that we are never alone, and that everything around us is a manifestation of the divine. And as long as there is existence in this world or any other, we are always surrounded by the divine, even though we may sometimes forget. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love for all that you do for us in our lives. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. And I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.